conversations. So if you're struggling to have those tough conversations at work, maybe you have a team member that isn't, doing their job the way that they should be, but anytime you've tried to approach the subject or you've wanted to talk about the results, you get an incredible amount of pushback and you think, all right, it's just not worth having that conversation. But I'm here to tell you, and you probably already know this, but having those tough conversations is an essential piece of your responsibility as a leader at work. So let's dive into it today, because I've been where you are. I've also helped clients do the exact same. So I've had a client who in the past has been working with our team members, and they were not performing. They weren't doing their responsibilities as they should. They were missing out on KPIs, etc. But avoiding the conversation wasn't helping in the results or the performance either. And it wasn't until we worked through and I shared the strategy I'm going to share with you today in today's video. It's a 4-step strategy that it allowed her to successfully navigate that conversation at work. And also, more importantly, it's not just the navigation of the conversation, but it also improved the performance of that team member and the team as a whole. So let's dive into it today. And if this is the first time you're joining me, then welcome. I'm Kim Reimakers, the founder of the LeadHERship Academy, and I've helped many leaders navigate these tough types of conversations effectively. And with over 20 years of experience in corporate, I understand the challenges and I can guide you through them. So let's dig in, because I want to give you those actionable strategies. Like there's 4 steps that we're going to talk about today. So the first, let's just cover off. I know we talked about a little bit in the intro, but when it comes to specific mistakes that you find yourself making, one of those is just the avoidance. Right? I have clients that goes like, I don't want to cause a conflict, so I'm avoiding those difficult conversations. Or the handling of tough conversations within my team is a constant struggle. Let's be honest. When things are going great, yes, it's easy to have conversations around, that KPI is being met. You're performing really well. How do we grow? What's your next step? Those are easy conversations. But the conversations around, all right, I see that your performance is lacking. I see that, you haven't met your objectives. Did you not understand the objectives? Was it not clear? What's the problem? Are we lacking resources? Those are a lot more difficult to manage. And if you avoid conflicts, and this is going to be a mass generalization, but a lot of women, we have been taught through society and as we've grown up that we need to be nice and likable, and we also need to get along. So we've never really been taught to have those tough conversations in essence, and now that feels really uncomfortable for you as a leader. So that's the first mistake, is just avoiding those conversations to begin with. The second one is going into it unprepared, right? So I have clients that come out just like, well, I don't know what to say when it comes to talking to not my client, those are mine, but talking to my team members about that their performance is lacking, that they haven't met their sales goals for this year, and that they are at risk of underperforming. Or they go into these conversations and they find that they didn't prepare enough and it ends up backfiring. I had one client that I was working with, and for her, she's like, I knew what I was going to say. I knew what was needed to be said and what we were going to talk about. And I could see the path that had been taken, the actions that team member had taken and had not taken, and what was needed to improve. And then I got an entire amount of pushback in the sense of like, well, you've understood it incorrectly. You don't understand what I'm going through right now. I'm doing all of this other work that you haven't even taken into consideration. And all of that pushback from that team member led her to back off and think, oh my goodness, maybe I got it wrong. So when she did that, she also ended up not being able to still hold that team member accountable and actually have the outcome to the conversation that she needed to have. And the third mistake that I often see is ending up being, you tend to get emotional or defensive in a tough conversation, right? this is not going to be knock on women, but let's be honest, we get known for being emotional. So the least amount of emotion that we show in a conversation, a tough conversation, is going to be almost taken the wrong way. What I'm not saying here is that you don't show emotion. I want to be very clear on that. But you want to understand, you want to be aware of the emotion that's coming up. And if you find yourself in a conversation, in a tough conversation, you're getting emotional or getting defensive. And what does defensive look like? Defensive is going to look like you're over explaining, like you're giving multiple reasons and you keep going and explaining more and more. You're defending yourself versus actually helping that other person. And when it gets to be a struggle to stay more calm and composed because of either the amount of pushback or how uncomfortable this conversation feels, and maybe the tough conversation isn't with a team member, but it could be with your manager, it could be with another leader. I remember situations in the past for myself where I really struggled having a conversation with senior leaders when I was in the beginning parts of my career, because I was very nervous. But I remember this question coming up of like, okay, so what could I have done differently that would have helped you improve the outcome of X, Y, and Z? My first reaction, oh no, nothing. You did everything right. Like, right? I was there, like essentially soothing their ego. And I really just found myself going, okay, no, it's all my fault. I didn't realize this, right? And I took it all on me without realizing that was a key moment that I could have given really constructive feedback. And because I let my nerves get the best of me, and because I just got tongue-tied and thought like, I don't want to upset this person, I want to avoid any type of conflict, I didn't provide any kind of effective feedback in that moment in time, even though when I walked out of the room, I just like, oh, man, there were so many things that would have been very much helpful for me during the time we were working together with the senior leader that would have been really helpful, like getting the amount of resources, getting the support, getting even just like, hey, I need you to like put your like thumb on the scale on this sense, right? I need you to speak up and talk to the right people, make the right connections. So when it comes, just let me know if you may have been making one or multiple ones of these mistakes where you're avoiding these difficult conversations, you're not preparing, or you find yourself getting either emotional or defensive in that conversation. And all of that is going to lead to having unresolved conflicts. Because let's be honest, the problem doesn't go away because you've avoided it. It just ends up lingering and festering. And even worse, especially as your team grows, is that can actually affect your entire team's performance because your team members will see it as well. Oh, okay, so you're not addressing it? Well, then I can do something as well, right? So you end up having people that are going to kind of like back off maybe in their performance because what's the point? If you're not able to address the other person, then I can, take a step back or take it a little more easier. It's also going to damage relationships because if you handle these conversations poorly, it's going to damage the relationship that you have with your team member or even possibly with those leaders or the manager because you haven't really been able to handle that conversation in a way that's constructive and that moves the needle forward. And I already just highlighted a little bit is that you don't address the issues, especially if it's within a team and you're avoiding those conversations. You're not addressing issues that affect directly the team performance. So your team will not perform optimally. And like I shared, I know what it's like because I've been there. I've handled tough conversations at work, but I've learned that over time, and I'm a big conflict avoider, is that if I don't address the issue, if I don't speak up, it only gets bigger and it only gets worse. And then by the time I do it, I've made such a mess of it that I've learned over the years, I'm going to nip it in the bud. Let's start at the beginning. If I'm finding myself already avoiding a conversation, it's like, no, what's going on here? Let's dig into it. And then I'm going to have that conversation because if I don't, I'm going to have to deal with those consequences down the road. And I might as well do it right now. So if you think about it yourself, And think about it in terms of like if it's summer, the sun's out, right? If you're out on a lake and you're navigating a boat through some rough waters. Now, if you don't steer that properly, you're going to end up completely off track. And that's what we need when it comes to tough conversations. It needs to also be careful. You need to have some careful steering of the conversation to keep it both on track, but also to make sure that it stays effective. And as I shared at the beginning, one of my clients was struggling with this exact piece and more specifically of holding their team members accountable. And I've had multiple clients with the same issue. What happens is when they use the 4 steps I'm going to share with you just right after this, is that they found that their team performance really does increase because things are getting done. Your team is starting to see, hey, you're taking accountability, you're holding them accountable. They're starting to do their work. I better start taking my responsibility seriously as well. So it resulted both in increased performance for that individual, but also in the team. So let's dive in, because within the LeadHERship Accelerator, there are 4 steps that we walk through. And I'm going to share with those 4 steps with you today. So, excuse me, I have a little bit of an itch. So the first one, and if you've got questions along the way, just drop them in the chat, or if at all time, you can always message me or DM me, and I'm happy to answer them as well. So when it comes to that first step, is about getting clear on your expectations and the intention. So before you ever enter into the room to have that conversation, you need to know for yourself what you want to achieve in that conversation. What is the intention? Is the intention for that, for example, if it's a team member, is the intention for that they know what their responsibilities are and what actions they need to take and what the performance needs to be at? Then that becomes a lot clearer, because from there, you also are going to go further in depth and thinking, okay, what are the exact responsibilities that they need to be performing? What is the outcomes that I'm expecting? And be specific. Also, what are the actions that I expect them to be taking? Maybe the actions part, depending on how you lead and how that team member needs to be led, you have a little more flexibility there, right? You're being very clear on what they need to do and less so on the how to do it, but depends on your team members. I want you to take in this step of getting clear on your expectations and intentions, you want to write down your key points as well as those outcomes so that you at least have that there. And think about this, when you've got this clear, it's like you're planning a road trip. So you know what your destination is, and because you are clear on your destination, you know where you are right now, you can start plotting out the stops along the way that make sure that you reach your goal without a whole bunch of detours along the way. Now, then we get into step 2. And this is where oftentimes women get stuck, and maybe this is not only women, I should say, but is when it also all of a sudden thinks that, well, if I have to hold someone accountable, it's going to feel like I'm, attacking them, or they may feel personally attacked. Well, we want to make sure, so this is step 2, that we need to remember that it's business and it's not personal. So you want to keep that conversation professional by focusing more on the issue at hand and not the person. Right? You want to focus on behaviors and not personality traits or things of like, oh, you know what? Like, I don't like necessarily what you're wearing. Okay. I know this is a very silly example, but that can be very personal, right? Depending on your uniforms needed at work, if you have uniforms at work or if not. But in a professional setting, that can come off as a much more personal. Or it could be also like, well, I don't really appreciate how you approached that person and you use this type of communication. Okay, when you have that type of situation, I want you to really look at like, what are the behaviors here that we need to address, and use as much neutral language without the judgment on your side. And one way to do this also is just staying very curious. Like, okay, well, I see that, you had to meet this result, and you spoke to X, Y, and Z, which caused a misunderstanding, and where your curiosity can come in is just saying, now I'm curious, what would you have done differently? Or you could even take a step back and say, I'm curious, what did you consider that led you to choose this path? Because what that does is it opens up the conversation to also start seeing what's happening from the perspective of the individual. So how to do this is think about it more in almost like a coaching form. So imagine you're a coach, you're giving feedback to a player. You focus on improving their performance. You don't criticize them as a person. It's not about likability, it's about their performance. So you might have team members, and I've had this in the past too, where you don't necessarily get along on a personal level. That has no bearing on that conversation at that moment in time. You want to focus on making sure that you talk about their behaviors, the results, what things they can change, but you don't talk about, you don't move into the personal realm. Now, step number 3 is all about keeping it simple. Don't over-explain. Now, I know we talked about one of those mistakes is you're getting emotional and defensive. Well, guess what? Over-explaining is definitely one sign that you're diluting your message. So you want to make sure you stay concise, you stick to the point, because otherwise you're going to dilute the message and you're going to lead to misunderstandings. Stick to facts as much as possible and avoid bringing in unrelated issues. So if you are addressing that they haven't met their performance in this current month, don't necessarily bring in that and by the way, that you missed the deadline on that report that was supposed to be coming in last month and we haven't talked about it. It starts to dilute the whole message. You want to stick to, first of all, if you've done it right in the first step, you know what you're going to talk about. You are clear your expectations and your intentions. So when it comes to this step 3, it is really about staying concise and to the point. You give as much information as is needed for the other person to understand, but not more. Don't find yourself going in explaining it in 2 or 3 or 4 different ways, because likely if you really ask yourself, is this explanation for that person, for their understanding, or is this explanation for me as a justification for what I'm doing right now? Because there is a huge difference. So you want to make sure that you keep that feedback and in that conversation concise and keep it on track. So this is what I worked with one of my clients with, and she learned that when she kept her feedback simple and direct, her team members were able to understand the expectations and act on them much more effectively. She got a lot better results because now it was very clear as to what was needed. So that is step number 3. Number 4, this is the last step, is there needs to be a follow-up. Please do not walk away and then say, all right, well, I've told my team, or even if you're talking to other leaders, right? You might be having a conversation with a colleague and you found, hey, you know what, that report that you delivered. So I'm thinking of one of my clients who was compiling at the end of the month all the financial reports. She was always getting them late. And she started off okay, well, I'll just figure it out. I'll make it myself. But we worked through a number of steps so that she could use this framework, but also have conversations with her colleagues of listen, these reports need to be done by this and this time. And you need to have this information provided. And so what the follow-up is the next month wasn't oh, you came in late, no worries, I'll do it, don't worry about it. But we actually set it up beforehand of a week before, just all right, listen, I'm just following up because as per our conversation that we had after last month's monthly reports, I need this information for those reports by this and this deadline. And when you follow up with this, you're ensuring that all those agreed upon actions are going to be taken. And it shows that you are as committed to the outcome, but you're also going to hold other people accountable. So it's important for you, and this is what you do also in that first step of understanding your expectations and your intentions, is you then you also have highlighted for yourself, or at least come up with what the timeline is for follow-up and for checking in, because this isn't a one and done. And I think that is a really big misconception that often happens when we have a tough conversation, especially if you're an avoider of tough conversations. Like, oh my God, if I could just get through this conversation, it'll be done and I can move on. Except you don't. You think of it like you're planting a tree. Now, as much as I love the trees, you don't just plant it and then walk away and like, all right, I've got the tree there. It's going to do its thing and it's done. No, because after you plant that tree, you still need to water it and care for it to ensure that it grows strong and healthy. The same thing needs to happen when it comes to having those tough conversations, whether it's with your colleagues, whether it's with your team members, whether it's with other leaders, because you want to ensure that the changes that you have spoken about and that you've laid forward, or how you've held them, you've asked them to take accountability, that they actually take root and they start to bear their fruits. In that case, we're sticking to plant analogy. Okay, so just in summary, really quickly, we've got 4 steps. So if you are finding it really difficult to navigate tough conversations, you might be avoiding them, or you find yourself getting really struggling to be with defensiveness during these tough conversations, then here's 4 steps from inside my LeadHERship Accelerator. Step 1 is to get clear on your expectations and your intentions. Step 2 is to remember it's business, it's not personal. So keep that conversation focused on the issue at hand, keep it focused on the behaviors and not the person, because it'll help you reduce emotional reactions and keep the discussion productive. Step number 3, you want to keep it simple. You don't want to over-explain, so be concise and to the point. And step number 4, after the conversation, make sure you follow up, ensure accountability. You want to circle back, make sure that that person is taking the actions as you had agreed upon. Now, if after all of this, you're still thinking to yourself, okay, well, this is great, but I'm a natural avoider of these types of conversations, or I've never really been, I can do them, but I'm not really super comfortable with them, because either you don't know how to approach it, or you're still in that zone of like, I just really want my team to like me, and I want them to be excited and happy to work with me in their jobs. Then I have a first step that you can take today. And that is in joining the From Strength to Strategy workshop. Now, within the workshop, it's going to be, it starts in 2 days. So it's on Friday. So you still have got time to jump in on that if you want to join us in person. And next week, Tuesday and Wednesday, will be the online workshop for that. So you can jump into that as well. You'll get clear on your strengths, and you're going to learn how to lead from your strengths. So rather than trying to, take on somebody else's way of leading or being more authoritative, which is always like, it's like a shirt or dress that just doesn't quite fit right. Well, now you get to learn how to lead from your own strengths, and you can turn those into your own personalized leadership strategy for success for the rest of 2024 and beyond, because it doesn't just stop at the end of the year. Now, here's my encouragement to you. Don't wait until those unresolved issues and all those avoided conversations take a toll on your team, on your leadership, on your personal brand and reputation in your organization. Sign up today for this workshop so you can start building your own leadership strategy and become a more confident and effective communicator. And if you're thinking like, all right, I don't know if I can make the workshop, no worries. Let's have the conversation in the DMs, and we can figure out what does work for you, because there are lots of opportunities within the academy to support you and your leadership. I'm wishing you a really great day. Again, if you've got any questions, please drop them below, and I will talk to you again soon.